But now we get to our main topic today, which is let's read the Dungeon Master's Guide. We did this with the player's handbook, and it was quite popular. And when we did our poll of what do you want to see next, it was very close between something like look at other games and look at the Dungeon Master's Guide. So we're going to take a break. We're still going to look at other games, but we're going to sort of alternate with looking at other games, checking out the Dungeon Master's Guide, or maybe doing an interview again. So we'll keep the we'll keep all of our plates in the air as we spin those bad boys as fast as we can. Another reason that we're going to do reading Dungeon Master's Guide now is because we got a great video this past week from Chris Perkins, who talked about working on the new version of the Dungeon Master's Guide that will be part of what was called 1D&D, which is now just called, it's 5e. So the next 5e Dungeon Master's Guide is being worked on. And so let's talk first about what Chris talked about, and then we can look at the current Dungeon Master's Guide, both as its own discrete work and as something that is going to be changed based on what Chris and his team have seen from its users.
Yeah, and we've seen now a couple of different ways that information's been disseminated. We had the D&D Direct, information that was shared at the D&D Summit. And by the time this airs, I'll have a blog up that actually will the last of the blogs on the D&D Summit. And I'll talk about some of the DMG Player's Handbook and Monster Manual revision information that they shared. There are also other folks out there who covered it for the summit. And then we've had some additional marketing videos, and then this video. And in the marketing videos, one thing that I haven't heard mentioned widely, but I thought was really fascinating, is the deck of many things. There's a product that centers around it, and it's going to have the deck in it and more cards than before. So the list of things that can happen that you can pull from is expanded. So that'll be interesting to see. I thought that was fun.
Yeah, that's funny. So let's look at the new proposed DMG format. And Chris was very clear in his video saying that there are wonderful, and he emphasized wonderful things that we can do to make the DMG a more and better user experience. And that's very true. But my question then is, which users? Because you have many different users with many different wants for a Dungeon Master's Guide. So it's great to say that we're going to make a new user experience. It's then figuring out which users you're going to create this for. And as we mentioned earlier, it sounds like they're now moving from people who know how to run a game to people who may be learning how to run a game with this new Dungeon Master's Guide. So
Yeah.
did you want to say something?
Well, I mean, I know we're going to dig into this throughout this series and even today, but I think that's the fascinating question: is how do you strike this balance between the audiences, the writing style, the material? It is an incredible task. It's almost like, if you pulled a wish and the wish is going to be twisted in some way. It would be like, well, you've been granted writing the Dungeon Master's Guide, and then you'd realize, oh wait, this is fraught with peril.
Yes. It's the old "may you get everything your heart desires" curse. Right. So here's what Chris said will be in the Dungeon Master's Guide 5e revised. First, he said there will be a section on the basics, introducing the game rules and being a DM. Then he said there will be a section on walking through common situations that DMs go through, some of the things that can come up during play, especially the problematic parts, the traps, as he called them, and how to address those issues when they come up. So he didn't say chapter, he said section for 1 and 2. Then he said chapter 3. So I can assume that he meant the first 2 chapters were those basics and walking through common situations. Chapter 3 is the rules compendium, specifically things not in the player's handbook. And he talked about sort of an alphabetical listing. And later he called it the rules cyclopedia. So probably that's sort of just 2 words that mean the same thing.
Yeah.
Chapter 4 would be adventure building. Chapter 5 would be campaign building. Chapter 6 is cosmology. Chapter 7 would be magic items. Chapter 8 would be a surprise. Then there would
Yeah.
be some appendices as well as a poster map. And when asked what's on the poster map, Chris said, that's a surprise.
Surprise.
So 2 surprises
Yeah,
coming our way.
and it's interesting because there's the poster map, and the appendices include a map appendix and a lore glossary appendix.
Mhm,
And so, it's interesting. What is this poster map going to be that would be helpful? Hmm.
mhm. Yeah, I that's a the next few topics of conversation across the internet will be what are the surprises that are in the chapter 8 and poster map. But he also mentioned pulling in DMG worthy material from sources like Tasha's, and he gave a session 0 description and how to as something that was in Tasha's that should be in the Dungeon Master's Guide, which makes absolute perfect sense.
Yeah. But it is one of the reasons that they said at the D&D summit that, in general, 5e will not 2014 5e will not require conversions, but they're taking so much out of Tasha's and Xanathar's that those books will be reprinted because things will be duplicative or counter each other because they're borrowing from that, right? If you think of like Tasha's and all the things that uh, classes can choose, right, as optional pieces, a lot of that's being brought into the Unearthed Arcana and the
Mhm.
2024 version. So it becomes redundant and even confusing. So they're going to be reprinted.
We saw this in 4th edition as well. When the DMG2 came out,
Mhm.
they pulled out pieces of other content and
Mhm.
gave it as examples. And I know this because someone came up to me and said, "I loved your contributions to the Dungeon Master Guide 2." And I said, "I did not contribute to the Dungeon Master's Guide 2." And they said, "Yes, you did." So I went and I looked, and sure enough, they had taken a skill challenge that I had written into one of my dungeon delves, pulled it out, and put it into the Dungeon Master's Guide as one example of a way that you could create and run a skill challenge.
You
So
thought, gee,
they
I wish you'd
have
asked me
there's
about this because I probably would have been too, fine tuned it or
yeah,
something.
yeah, that's
Mm.
yeah, we'll take what we can get. Uh, but that's something that they've done in the past, so we know that they're, willing and able to do so. But there is also so much third-party material out there that's in existence, that's already been written and it's already beloved, like the Lazy Dungeon Master's Guide from Mike Shea, like any number of videos, any number of blogs, any number of things that have taken people's experiences, taken their work from previous editions, and updated it and put it into a form that's very easy to use. And so, Wizards of the Coast could just as easily find that material and in this case let the person know that you're going to use it and pay them for it and put it out there that you could do that. Now, I'm sure that Wizards also wants to create their own material, put their own spin on it, and so on. But that's something that's there that they could leverage from the community if they needed.
Yeah, for sure. But if they think to do it that way, that's the question I keep going to is what kind of book do you want to write,
For
and do
sure.
you know why you want to write a certain type of book? It's a hard question.
Yeah, and that
What do you
goes to
base
this
the
next
feedback on?
question. The next question Chris was asked was, "What is the most frequent comment or question that you get about the Dungeon Master's Guide?" And Chris said, the thing he gets the most is, "Oh, I didn't know that was in there," because the lack of structure, the lack of clarity, the lack of organization in the Dungeon Master's Guide showed that people don't know that there are firearms in that book
Right.
because it's not called out in any way. It's sort of stuck in the middle of a chapter on that is ostensibly on something else that doesn't easily draw the attention of dungeon masters who want fire to use firearms in their games.
The D&D summit, he said he hears three common complaints. I don't know what's in it, I can't find it, and I don't use it. And so all the
Mhm.
changes are trying to improve on those issues. So I'm glad they heard those issues because they are, uh, they are important, and for sure you see them. But it's easy to point at the problem. It's really hard to point at the solution.
That's it.
That's the thing, right? It's like it's one thing with the player's handbook. Like there are easy ways. Like you can look and say, like, oh, here's how you solve these various problems. With the Master Guide, it's harder because it's like, to what extent are you just inspiring? To
Mhm.
what extent are you providing content that I might use once and never want to read again? But that first read is really important, especially if
Mhm.
it's all around a new player, right? That might be super well worth doing, and I'm never going to read it again or seldom read it again, right? Because I'm done. I went through it.
Yep. And one thing to look at is how do people use it and how do people want to use it? Because what you are giving people are the tools to create their own experiences. Because the game is a tool to create their own experiences. So looking at it as a textbook rather than a game book is one direction that you could go because you're teaching people how to use this game. Uh, but there are so many game masters out there who do not want to be taught, right? They want to create on their own and
Mhm.
they want not to, they don't want to learn how to do it. They just want to do it. And you give them the tables that they need to roll on to do it. So it is a problem without a perfect solution.
Yeah.
It's just several imperfect solutions that you do to the best of your ability.
And I think also
What
that
else? Oh,
just
go
that
ahead.
today's world is so different than the world of the AD&D DMG. There are so many sources of information out there, so many different ways to get things, that what the book should try to do has to take into account that, right? So how do you make this
Mhm,
book, if you want this book to be one to which DMs turn to time and time again versus read through once and then are done, absorbed, done, that's a
mhm,
really different thing that you have to do, and it's hard to think through how do you make this repeatable and useful. And I love looking at comparing the different versions, like when I compare, the Return to the Lazy Dungeon Master and how it approaches telling you about things and providing a process that you will use. So it's very process oriented, and it's very, follow these steps, and whenever you're running a game session you might want to refer back to these steps, right? And there
mhm,
are some useful tables and things like that, but that's what it's about. Or, the DMG and the DMG2 for 4th edition, they do a very different approach as well into how they educate the DM, and then provide tools that, at first, it's really nice advice, and it's advice that very cleverly dances between what a new player needs to hear and an experienced player needs, a DM needs to hear, in a way that pleases both, which is super
mhm.
hard to do, while then
Yeah.
also giving you these tools that you want to come back to do things like, yeah, monster themes or traps or any kind of things that you're going to want to drop in. And that's an interesting, it's a hard approach to do.
Mhm. Yeah. Chris also said that there will be more common magic items put into the Dungeon Master's Guide, as well as more magic items overall. Stray bits that are from other sources or stray bits from the Dungeon Master's Guide itself that are in locations that are hard to find will be brought into the rules cyclopedia. There will be more show and instead of more telling. So give examples of the things that this content is talking about, as well as an outline for a full campaign. And as I said earlier, those outlines, those templates can be super important for teaching how to structure something in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, a point that Chris Perkins makes that I think is a really great point is that if a new DM or even experienced DM looks at what's out there from Wizards, all of it is so incredibly polished and set up for publication, for printing, for display, all of that, that it doesn't reflect what you need to run an adventure that you improvised at the table. And
Mhm,
similarly, for a campaign, all you see are these enormous published books. But what should your campaign look like when you're setting up? What should your adventure look like, right? And so,
mhm,
my typical session is a page of bullet points, right? Like
mhm,
that's what I do. But when I write for publication, it's so vastly different than that. And so this idea of showing DMs what these examples should look like is cool. And I mean, that's one of my favorite things in Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master is that it provides a very concrete example of a sample campaign from levels 1 to 20 and makes it super easy to read that example and know how you would do that for a different type for your own choice of what your plot kind of story is. And that's really powerful.
Mhm. We get tell from Chris that they are going to provide some history for D&D lore, probably in that appendix. So when we mention Mordenkainen and we mention the Abyss and we mention those sorts of things, people can be on the same page.
Do you think that's important?
I think it can be important to have a common language that we fall back on. And this, again, I'm going to keep going back to teaching, and I
Mhm.
apologize.
No, yeah, no.
But when we start the D&D section of the class, which is sort of the last third of the class, we have 60% of the students who, when I say, you know, challenge rating, they know exactly what I'm talking about. Whereas the people who aren't don't. And so I think it can be important to understand what Greyhawk is, to
Mhm.
understand these larger terms. You don't have to give a full paragraph, but just something for people to look
Mm.
up when we're talking about these acronyms, when we talk about certain things, to just have a place to go look it up very easily. So as a glossary rather than as, a full-on chapter on its own.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure. I keep thinking about this and wondering whether that's a space well spent versus whatever else could be there. And maybe it is, but I also just feel like one of the things that Chris said, I forget if it's a video, the summit was there's a lot of misinformation out there online.
Mhm,
And I kind of thought, well, sure, but also some of the best lore is actually found online too, and D&D sources can be wrong, and so sometimes
mhm,
the FR wiki can be the best place to find anything about the Forgotten Realms. Now, it may have multiple editions worth of information, but that's the reality of the lore. And
mhm,
and sometimes you find things that are clearly a home campaign, but that might be exactly the kind of thing you want anyway, because it's just ideas for how to use these people and villains and whatever. So I don't know. Yeah, it's interesting.
mhm. Again, I think if it's kept short, I think if it's an appendix, it
Mhm.
gives wizards the ability to capture the narrative that they wanna capture with what these things are, and that's one way to help with misinformation, is just to say, "This is what we at Wizards of the Coast think these words are and what these words mean."
Mhm.
Yeah. What else do we get from Chris? We
Can I
we
go
we
back a
heard from
second?
Chris.
You know what
You
I
sure
want?
can.
I
What do
would
you want?
rather it be a super short description, which is what I guess they're planning, but then a what to do with this, like adventure seeds or something like that. Like, give me that
Mhm,
next bit that makes me want to use that information.
mhm.
That, of course, requires more space, but then I think I'd have that utility I'd want out of it. Sure, tell me what the red wizards if they are, but then inspire me to use it.
Mhm. Yeah, I could see that. I don't know how, but we'll find out. What else do we get from Chris? We get Chris talking about why he loves being a DM, and that needs to be captured in the Dungeon Master's Guide. So he talks about the power of storytelling, the fun of getting together with friends and telling a story. But D&D storytelling is different from other storytelling because of the spontaneous eruption that comes from the randomness that D&D brings, the rolling a 20, the rolling a natural 1. And so that also needs to go into the Dungeon Master's Guide to be able to let people use the power of that sort of role-playing game storytelling at the table with their players. And he talks about the creativity that players can bring to the table, both in terms of the storytelling aspect of the game, but also in just the game mechanics of are you choosing to use that spell at that particular time, and the fun that that brings to the player, the DM, and the other players at the table to say, ooh, I never thought of using that spell in that way. Let's see what happens.
Yeah.
Then he goes into the fact that uh that this is more than just fifth edition while it's still fifth edition. He talked about the Dungeon Master's Guide not being a 10 out of 10 product, and they recognize that. And so they're doing this not only to, make a new version of fifth edition, but to make this book a 10 out of 10 in terms of its usefulness for players. And he admitted that the resources they had when they were making fifth edition were limited. They were doing the 3 core books at the same time as the starter set, at the same time as the Dragonspear Castle bridge book between D&D Next and 5th edition. And that the Dungeon Master's Guide had to wait in line in terms of the resources that were available, which led to it not being one of the reasons why it wasn't the 10 out of 10 that they were hoping it would be.
And clearly they have a much larger staff now, but I guess I still worry, and maybe it's just because of I work in organizations where all the time we will say, let's give this the proper time it needs, and then we don't have the proper time it needs, because Wizards, while they have more people on staff, they are doing more than ever before. They are in the middle of any number of projects right now that are being published and written and released and stuff and finalized in different stages. You get pulled into all these meetings all the time for these things. They've just reorganized. The company has reorganized. There are all kinds of things, and so is there really that much more time for the Dungeon Master's Guide? I hope so, but I'm not convinced, and also because when you have this sort of challenge of saying like, well, what should the book do differently? You need a lot of voices to workshop all of this and then bring it together. And I think, one interesting thing when you look at the 4th edition Dungeon Master's Guide is how many people did writing for it in different ways that was really rather expertly woven together so it reads like one voice. But there's a surprising number of people and really smart people, right? Like Robin Laws, who provided information for it, and it ends up in that book, even though it ostensibly, has like 2 names on the cover. I guess James Wyatt is on the cover of the DMG, but it's so many people actually writing that. And I wonder whether that is being done here, or is it, Chris getting locked in a room. And, if you have to lock someone in a room, Chris is one of the best people to do that. But for this type of goal, I think you want a lot of people doing a lot of thinking, taking the time. And I worry they're all very busy and we don't really have that much more time. I don't know.
Well, and that's why I made that point about stuff from other products being brought into the Dungeon Master's Guide. Yes, bringing it in from Tasha's is great. We have a ton, more than ever, of voices out there who have already done the work of what needs to go into a Dungeon Master's Guide. Do you know it? And I know it.
Yeah.
And we could, you and I, just 2 individuals who are, in the industry, not necessarily the heartbeat of the industry, but we've been around. We could send them a list of 10 books that if you take the content from this, you will be getting the information that dungeon masters need. And there is in organizations a hesitation to do that. There is within individual egos a hesitation to do that.
Sure.
And sometimes everything comes together and the perfect book is created. And more often than not, despite great talent, but despite great intentions, despite lots of resources being thrown at a problem, it still does not get to the level that it could.
Yeah. Yeah, I love reading accounts of like Steve Winter would talk about redoing 2E or creating 2E and all of the things they wanted to change but couldn't for reasons political, organizational, timing, cost, you name it, had to be scrapped even though they knew these things should be done differently, and just he could not, right?
And you and I have been around the world so many times in terms of business and stuff and experiences, and we know that this is not a Wizards of the Coast problem.
No,
This is not a Hasbro problem. This is a human being in a organization problem
yeah.
that every organization has, and every organization will always have throughout till the end of time, because organizations are imperfect in their structure.
Yeah. But that's where, if you want to be the best, you are constantly trying to fight those battles to create the processes, the communication, the organization that facilitates it, improves your chances that it will be
Right.
fantastic. And so
Yep.
I hope that happens.
Yep. Chris finally, at the end of the interview, talked about the monster manual for just a second. He says it's going to be bigger, maybe the biggest one ever. I assume he means the biggest monster manual from Wizards of the Coast ever, because at the end of second edition, that monstrous compendium, if you filled that binder,
Yeah.
was quite large. There will be new monsters added to fill in some gaps. There will be a reorganization of it. They will also be updating the monsters to make them more fun to play, more easy to play, and get to the right power level for the CRs. The CRs will not change, but everything else about the monster may change, as we saw with Monsters of the Multiverse. And there will be new art, not just in the monster manual, but across all of those books. Anything else specifically about Chris's talk? Because we will get into the current Dungeon Master's Guide if you so choose.
Yeah. Fantastic.
All right. Why don't we just start with the introduction?
Yeah.
And then next time we talk about the Dungeon Master's Guide, we will do our read through of it. So the current introduction to the Dungeon Master's Guide has a few quotes that I thought were telling, amusing, or spot on. And the first thing is, the first words of the new Dungeon Masters, or the 5e Dungeon Master's Guide, is, it's good to be the Dungeon Master.
It's good to be the
And
king.
yes, it absolutely is good to be the Dungeon Master. As long as you have the right instruction manual to tell you how to do it, as long as you have the right tools at your disposal to be the Dungeon Master, as long as you have the right players who are ready and willing to be the people who are partaking of your Dungeon Master style and instruction and story, as well as you have an understanding of what you want to get out of your game so that you can do the right things to make that game happen, and on and on and on. So it's good to be the Dungeon Master, asterisk.
Yeah.
It says the Dungeon Master's Guide assumes that you know the basics of how to play our D&D tabletop role-playing game. If you haven't played before, the Dungeons and Dragons starter set is a great starting point for new players and DMs. And that's where I went, oh, we're already in trouble here. If within the introduction to your book, you're saying go somewhere else, if you really want to learn how to do this, that's trouble. Even if it said go to the player's handbook, I would have been, yeah, okay, that makes sense. But go to this other product that may not be exactly what you want it to be, that's trouble.
And of course, it's a bit myopic in that it imagined that the D&D starter set would always be there with clarity, and yet we've had several starter sets. And so which one, right? Does the Stranger Things starter set count? Can I use the what was the other cartoon one? Can
Yeah. You
Right.
don't want to use that. But what one was it? Oh, it's oh, yeah. You have to look back over your
Rick and
shoulder to
Morty.
it. Rick and Morty. I'm
Right?
like
Should I use
Bob
the
and
Rick and
Henry
Morty
now. That's
starter
right.
set? Is that the great starting point that I must read before doing this? And so, yeah, I agree with you. That is an interesting choice, and it's very different than, say, 4E starts its intro as how to be a DM, and the first line is not very inspirational. It's most games have a winner and a loser, and it goes on to really baby you through what is D&D. Very different approach, right?
Yeah. Yep. So there we go. So this initial section that describes what the DM does contains good stuff. It mentions you're going to do world building, and there are campaigns, and there are adventures, and there are sessions, and monsters, and traps, and treasure, and storytelling, and role playing. And the one word that I think is the most important word for a DM to learn is not mentioned not only in that section, but not mentioned in any of these sections
Mhm.
in any explicit way, is the word encounter.
That's interesting.
That is where the dungeon master and the players come together and meet and start to tell their stories. And in nowhere in this intro or in this book per se do they say where you and the players meet each other is during encounters where you act in a certain way and they act in a certain way and all this fun happens. Uh, and I hope that when you get to the new version of the 5e Dungeon Master's Guide, there will be lots and lots and lots of information about the encounter and about telling the dungeon master where they and their players are going to rub together and start a fire.
Yeah.
The fire
Yeah.
of a fun game.
Yeah, I agree with you fully. It's not that it's a bad start, but it's one that I think misses its mark on what it should be trying to do with that initial text. And I think they do see that, right? From the interviews that suggest that we're going to go back and tell you the basics of the game. It sounds like they're going to try to change this to do that more.
Mhm. And they also then say these rules are organized into 3 parts. The first part will help you decide what kind of campaign you'd like to run. The second part will help you create the adventures, the stories that will compose the campaign, and keep the players entertained from one session to the next. And the last part will help you adjudicate the rules and modify them to suit your style of campaign. And when it's said that way, it sounds like it makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay, tell me what I'm going to be doing, and then help me do that, and then help me with the minutia. But is that the right order? Is it the right order if it's done correctly? Or is it the wrong order even if you do it well? I
And
don't know.
it goes back to what Graham's saying, right? Like especially if this book was thinking, hey, you just finished either reading or running the starter set. Now I'm going to tell you how to build a world. Wait, does that make sense? Does that
Mhm.
flow? Is that what the DM is looking for? And why is the information here not helping you run the starter set well, or it's.
Yeah. Should a starter set be a part of the Dungeon Master's Guide? Hmm.
Yeah, is it
It
mandatory that you buy the 3 core books and the starter set and read the starter set first? Is that
right.
the order of things? It's not the order of things that one would normally think of.
So I'm going to leave you, Teos, and all our listeners out
Hmm.
there with just one important question. How would you teach a DM to take on this beast that is running a fun, exciting game of D&D for your players? Because that's what we're really talking about here. And that's what we will come back to the next time we talk about Let's Read the Dungeon Master's Guide.
Love it.
All right. That said, we will thank everyone out there for being a listener. We really do appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day to hear us pontificate and provide hopefully good news and entertainment for you. If you enjoy what we do, we ask that you consider becoming a patron of the show. You can do so by going to patreon.com/masteringdnd and give us just a small bit of your hard earned money to continue to do this. There are people that already do that. They're called Masters of the Realms, uh, Masters of Dungeons, and Masters of the Multiverse. For those who give us just a bit, we thank you so much, you Masters of Dungeons. For Master of the Realms, you get a little extra. You get a mention in our show notes. And for those who give us everything they can, they are the Masters of the Multiverse. And those people, they get a special shout out. And so Craig Bailey, Steve Bissonette, Evil John, Darren Chandler, Andy Edmonds at Nerdronomicon, Ben Heisler and Paige Lightman, Sean Hurst, Brian King, Travis Lee, Post Fiction Audio, RPG Audio, Eric Mengi, the Micro Ant, the Yelling Sean Molly, Falcon Neal, Ross, Chance Russo at Drago Russo, Krishna Simone say, hey, Willie Mays, Joe Tyler, Matias Valero at Twin Portals, James Walton, and Graham Ward. Thank you so much. You can help us out also by leaving a review on Apple Podcast or on whatever podcatcher that you use to listen to the show. You can also subscribe to our show via YouTube if you would like to see our beautiful faces as you listen to our somewhat beautiful voices. Teos, where can people find you on the internet?
Find me at alphastream.org. I'm on Mastodon, AlphaStream, and yeah, from my blog, you can get to all the places I hide. Where do we find you, Shawn?
You can follow me on Twitter at Sean Merwin and the podcast on Twitter at Mastering D&D. The show is also on Mastodon, and I am on Mastodon at Tabletop Social.
Yeah, and I
You
want to
can
say,
also, oh, go ahead.
I just want to say that I've really appreciated how the Discord that we now have for folks who are members of the Patreon has been fantastic with some really great conversations and questions and things like that. It's been great.
The conversation on there is almost too good because I'm busy at work and something will pop
I
up and I'll
know.
be like, oh, let's just go. Oh, that's a great question. Let's have this 2-hour discussion. Oh, yeah, well, I should probably get back to work now. So if you are a patron of the show, you get access to that Discord server where there are great
Yeah.
suggestions, thoughts, conversations going on. And you can also, of course, leave comments on our YouTube channel, the Mastering Dungeons YouTube channel. So, Teos, we are swimming in the sea that is the new upcoming Dungeon Master's Guide. What are we going to do now?
I'm going to flip to the page that tells me in the new DMG how to get 1,278 of my closest friends together so that I can claim the Guinness World Record.
We will get right on that. Could it be one player and 1,227 of their sidekicks?
Yeah, or GMs. Like, what if it's all GMs and one player and they just are yelling like what to do?
I like that. I like that. Let's get that done.